It's lovely to be with you this morning, and my name's Howard, and I've been asked to speak on disability at a conference that's called Healing in the Steps of Jesus. There's a certain irony there, don't you think? Healing in the steps of Jesus. But steps have actually got a prominent place in disability campaigning, along with phrases such as, "Nothing about us without us." So some of you might be asking the question, where's his wheelchair? Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you and be controversial, but I don't have one. I do have an icon though. Here it is. To be honest, I don't like it, because I like to know how a person is feeling. And this icon doesn't tell me. It doesn't tell me if the person is feeling happy, or sad, or confused, or joyful. It doesn't tell me those things. I like this one a little bit better. It's got a sense of movement. It shows the individual looking active, doing something, rather than being passive, having something done to them. Let's watch a little video clip. This is a lady called Anna. Here she comes. How do you think Anna is feeling at this point on this day as she sits at the bottom of those steps in her wheelchair? We'll come back to that. Here's my favorite icon. This one's on the van of my friend, and it tells me something about him. So although you may see his disability before you see him, you know that he's got wheels and he loves speed. Now, others of you might be thinking, hold on a minute. This is a healing conference. So maybe Howard's going to tell us about how he used to be in a wheelchair, but then someone prayed for him, and now he's healed. Well, I'm sorry, but, you know, that's not my story. As if once I was in a wheelchair, but now I'm normal, whatever that might mean. As if once I was not all right, and now I am all right. That's not my story. The reality is, the population of the world is 7.8 billion. There are 7.8 billion versions of normal. This is Becky Tyler. Her normal is not my normal, nor your normal. I can only be normal as me. That's the only normality I know. Becky speaks through her eyes, through a speech synthesizer. I can't do that. Her normality is different to my normality. But does being all right mean that someone in a wheelchair is all wrong? You see, I think historically the church has struggled with that. We've struggled with this idea of normality. We've struggled with this idea that somehow disability might be connected with something wrong, or even with sin. So I want to suggest that one of the problems we have when it comes to relating to people whose normality is different to us is that we either care too little or we care too much. When we care too little, it might be just carelessness. We might not just be aware of that person's world, of how we are keeping them out of the society we live in. And when we care too much, it might be that we patronize people, or we disempower them, which isn't really caring at all, is it? Caring too much or caring too little, how can we stop it happening? I want to suggest that one way is to include ourselves in the group. Remember the disciples? Jesus, Rabbi, this man was born blind. Did he sin, or did his parents sin? It's an illogical question. How could he sin during his 9 months in the womb? He was born blind. But they asked the question, and I can just hear Jesus muttering, "Oy vey," under his breath, although Yiddish hadn't quite been invented yet. But there may be another explanation, guys. And maybe Jesus is thinking at this point, not all disabilities can be seen. The man might be physically blind, but you, my disciples, your thinking is blinded. You have blind spots, you are blinkered. You're somewhat blinkered. But we can't blame the disciples. That was the culture of their day. That's what they understood. That was the theology of their day. They knew that there were lots of steps going up to the temple. They knew that people with disabilities weren't allowed in. But the reality was that everyone was at a distance from the Holy One. Everyone. Some distances were bigger than others. People with disabilities might have been at the back of the queue. But most of us, the nations, could only come into the court of the Gentiles, to the outer courts. If you were a Jewish woman, you could go a bit further. If you were a man, of course, you could go a little bit further still. And then came the priests. And then just once a year, the high priest could go in to the Holy of Holies with fear and trembling and an offering for himself and his people. There was a hierarchy there. And we could do that today. It wouldn't be very respectful, would it? But we could line up people in terms of how disabled they are. We could have the Usain Bolts of Guildford at one end, and then go right down to the other end, and we'd have people like Becky, and people like Anna, and people like the late Stephen Hawking. But there would be a continuum. There would be no obvious cut-off point. But then people might say disability is more than just wheelchairs. We might have to consider intellectual disabilities, and then we would have a new order. Suddenly, Stephen Hawking would be at the other end, wouldn't he? Yeah, he would swap over. And then other people might say, but what about other disabilities? And it starts to get very complicated, because we're holistic beings, and one thing affects another, and on one day we will feel differently to a different day. How are we ever going to decide who gets into our temple? But I'm still asking another question. Why was there this apparent link between disability and sin? I think we might have to go a long way back to find out. You see, I read in Genesis that we used to walk with God in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day. We used to walk with God. And suddenly, we didn't anymore. We weren't able to walk with God. And we weren't able to walk with one another very easily either, were we? Dare I say it, standing up here without a wheelchair? But that isolation is probably the biggest disability humanity ever faced. So we're all faced with that common disability, this limitation. Imagine being cut off from God and distanced from one another. Not all disabilities are visible, and not all disabilities cause suffering. Some people with disabilities are more afflicted by the social prejudices they have to deal with every day than with some medical condition. So who needs healing? But where was God to be found after the fall? Behind a fence, waving goodbye? No, he was outside. He was alongside us, and he's been traveling with us ever since. And by sending his son to die, God became vulnerable. For Jesus became human And like all humans, he was in a sense disabled, or at least limited, especially at his birth, when he needed to be carried across the manger, and at his death, when you're on a cross, you're limited physically. It's fairly disabling, isn't it? And yet, the life and death and resurrection of Jesus changed everything, didn't it? Suddenly, we began to realize that we were all ill and needed a doctor. There were no exceptions. Those who served at the temple and those who were at the back of the queue. Everybody needed God, the healer. So how are we ever going to decide who gets into our temple? Jesus had an answer. He said, invite everybody in. Invite everyone. And those who don't want to come can make their excuses. And when they turn up together, they will become the temple of my Holy Spirit. But you know, it's not enough to just invite people in and then divide them into groups. Some sit over there, some sit over here. Jesus called people to be his disciples, to join him in ministry. Are we ready for that? Are we ready to see people we consider to be weak ministering to us instead of us praying for them? At Acorn, we believe that God calls us to show mutual respect and to treat one another with dignity. In practice, that means, for example, that we ask people, what would they like Jesus to do for them? And if someone in a wheelchair asks us to complete a marathon, we don't assume they want to walk before they start that marathon. But if they want to pray for that, we will pray for them for that, because Jesus is more than able to meet all your needs. When was the last time you rested in God? Allowed yourself to be carried by him? We all need to be carried by the Lord, because we all need to hear God's heartbeat. So here's the challenge. Consider your areas of disability or your limitations. In each area, we have a choice. Either we recognize and accept those limitations, or we can fight against them. And if we find ourselves fighting against them, then let me suggest we do one of two things. We can ask God to take them away, that is healing, or we can ask God to give us his peace in the midst of our circumstances, that is wholeness. I've been told that God is a wounded healer, and as Jesus still bears the scars, he does. But remember, scars are wounds that have been healed. So why not accept his invitation to come to the table and ask him for healing? I want you to take 5 minutes now and turn to the person beside you and ask, or speak about this question. In which areas of your life do you need healing? And in which do you need wholeness? 5 minutes. Turn to the person beside you now and discuss that. Thank you.